So last week we talked about the Gospels generally speaking, and outside of that, the New Testament generally speaking, all of the backgrounds for the New Testament as a whole and the backgrounds for the Gospels as a whole. I wanted to go back and pick up on two things that we kind of left off from Thursday. One, we have this other form of criticism. I think most of the time on Thursday we talked about the synoptic problem, which is an aspect of source criticism, which just means what sources are coming into play when we're reading these gospel texts. All right. I also want to talk about form tradition. When we're talking about form, we're essentially focusing on how are the gospels presented to us? In what form do they take? Most of us are familiar with this on some level. There is an amount of time where Jesus' stories exist as an oral tradition that are not written down. And there's debate about what form they take and how they're actually presented to people. So think of it this way. Jesus, while he's walking around, teaches a bunch of stories. We call them parables. And probably for a while, because of the way that Jesus taught and the way that he used this vivid imagery of normal, rural, agrarian things, vines and branches and sowing seeds and people catching fish, these relatable images, people memorize the parables. So the audience is there, they hear this moving parable that has this vivid imagery and they remember it, especially if they follow Jesus for any amount of time. He probably teaches the same parables repeatedly. He goes to Capernaum and teaches the same parables. He goes to Bethsaida and teaches the same parables, etc. So they're probably familiar with them. And then when they're going around and sharing the message of Jesus, they probably remember those parables and repeat them. All right. So there are these fragments, these forms that are floating around for a while as part of this oral tradition where the stories are being shaped and the stories are being remembered. And eventually the stories start to be combined. This will get us to eventually our Gospels. And we'll talk about when we think they're written and how long it takes for this to happen. But if you think about just in terms of dates, when does Jesus die? Did we talk about this before? It's not technically 33. He's 33 years old, we think. But he's not born at 0 like he was supposed to be because 5th century monks are bad at math. So he's technically born at like 4 BC. So he dies, we think, in 29. This is because Pilate is actually expelled in like 31. And so we know that Jesus has to have died before Pilate is expelled. The earliest Gospels are definitely not written until at least, I'm trying to think of the most like conservative scholars dating Mark. I don't know, probably 60, right? But then scholars are push this out pretty far. Some would say the first gospel is written in 72, like Mark is written in 72, and that John isn't written until 110, right? So if you think about it in these terms, there's at least 30 years, at least, if not way more, between Jesus' actual death, the last time anybody heard him teach, and the first time somebody actually writes down the gospel stories. Now, they might exist floating around. Somebody might have written some things down, but most of it is existing as an oral tradition. And eventually Mark comes and takes these oral traditions and writes them down. There's a lot of conjecture, a lot of guessing about, oh, somebody wrote down these different sayings, and there's this little fragment floating around of sayings, and somebody else wrote these down, and somebody else wrote these down, and Mark compiled these written sources. We don't have any evidence for this. And it seems likely in a pre-literate society, right, where most of the people are not literate, that these stories are existing orally and that that's okay. In an oral society, it is perfectly fine for the story to be told orally. The way that I would explain this that helps us is if I tell you all a story, however many of you are in the class, hear the story. Now you all leave this room and you go and you talk to Ray. and one of you tells him the same story that I told you. What happens if one of you gets the story wrong at some point? Well, the rest of you would correct them, right? And the community works together to help shape and preserve and memorize this story, right? That if one of you intentionally tries to change the story to make yourself look better, right? Hector is the one telling the story. And in Hector's version of the story, Dr. Langley gave Hector an A for the course because he answered one question right, right? Somebody else would say, well, that's not really what happened, right? That's not the way the story went. So to be included in the community is to take part in repeating and retelling the story to each other. Good on this? So for them, it being an oral tradition is not really an issue. For us, it is, but that's only because we are a literate society. We value the text being written down much more than being repeated. Okay? One other thing to talk about when we're talking about the Gospels. There's this movement called the Jesus Seminar. It is, as far as I know, very much out of style now. But they developed this thing called the Quest for the Historical Jesus. And if you really get into it, there's the first quest and the second quest and the third quest. It sounds very, romantic and adventurous. It is essentially arguing that the Gospels are written late and they're written in an effort to consolidate power within the church. So Mark is writing the Gospel to try to get Markan Christians more power over Petrine Christians, right? Peter's Christians, or whatever it is. Luke is trying to gather his followers by writing a text in a certain way. And the argument goes, the text can't really be trusted. So we have to try to figure out how to get behind the texts to create a biography of the real Jesus, because the texts don't give us a real Jesus. So they argue that it's something like 18% of what we see in the Gospels is actually real Jesus. He was probably an itinerant rabbi. He was probably teaching in parables. He probably pretended to perform miracles, but we don't know the extent to which he actually did. All right, there's this great joke in, I think it's like an old episode of Family Guy, where they say something about, the miracles Jesus performed were really exaggerated. And it shows Jesus in the first century, and he's essentially doing like the thumb trick where it looks like you're pulling your thumb apart as a kid, and he goes, ah. This is essentially what the Jesus Seminar is doing, is they're by their own starting point removing, well, obviously Jesus isn't performing miracles because miracles aren't real. We know from history, miracles don't exist. We know that prophecy doesn't exist. So Jesus isn't really prophetic and a miracle worker, but he is probably an itinerant rabbi who said nice things, right? This becomes, academics don't really do this much anymore. I think they've kind of, by the end of the third quest, decided, really, there's no way to get to anything behind the Gospels. It's all just whatever you want Jesus to look like, you can pretend like that's what you find behind the Gospels. And so now they really have taken a step back from this to say, all we have is the Gospels. And so we need to focus on that. Sometimes they focus it on as saying, this doesn't really tell us anything about Jesus, but it does tell us about early Jesus followers. Mark exists as a document, and it tells us something about Mark's Christians. Good on this? Julian, go ahead. Yes, I mean, liberal scholarship, as far as I know, and I hate saying liberal and conservative, but scholars in these fields, yes, they do try to push back the date of the Gospels. And that is partly because it helps them to demonstrate that over time, the idea of Jesus is elevated. Jesus becomes more miraculous. He becomes more divine. He becomes more the Son of God over time. And if you can punt to say Mark is written in 80, that gives you 50 solid years of Christian development, to where then you can say Jesus isn't really walking around telling people he's the Messiah. He's not really walking around telling people that he's God. It's only a later development of Christians that are trying to, bolster their own guy, that it's at that point that they really start to invent these idea that Jesus is God. That doesn't really help, because you have Paul running around during the lifetimes of the earliest Christians, who is very clearly arguing that Jesus is the Messiah and also God, right? And we'll talk about that today when we get into Mark specifically. But yes, the farther you can push the Gospels from the historical Jesus, the more wiggle room you have to kind of inflict your own interpretation on it. If you want Jesus to be a social justice warrior, then you can move the Gospels farther away from Jesus and have Jesus concerned about the social issues that you're concerned about. And then the church, so like the example would be women. Jesus is a huge proponent of women. He's got women in his ministry. Women are part of the 12. Women are the first disciples and the first gospel messengers. But then the church wants to consolidate power under men, and they suppress the activity of the women. This is an articulated story, but we don't have any evidence of this. We don't have any evidence that Jesus has a better view of women than Mark or Matthew or Luke or John. Good? And it's mostly because we don't have any evidence of anything about Jesus outside of the Gospels, right? Paul, by his own admission, never met Jesus. So Paul just can't be a source of this is what Jesus was like, because Paul is our earliest documents and he never met the guy. And so we have this lack of sources to get back to anything behind the Gospels, which for me means the Gospels are everything, right? We have to dig into the Gospels and we have to see the story that they're presenting, because that's all we've got. Good on this? Good? Okay. So let's get into Mark itself, and we will start off with a basic question. Who wrote the Gospel according to Mark? Yes, it's a trick question because we assume it's written by Mark. Why do we assume this? Well, that's because in your book, it says Mark. It says it at the top of the page in big bold letters, and it says it in every subsequent page in little letters. Mark 1 and 2, Mark 2 and 3, Mark 4 and 5, on and on and on, right? The book tells you it's written by Mark. Go ahead, Julian. Yes, so when Paul writes his letters, Paul writes his name at the beginning. He writes his name at the end. He signs it, right? There's this famous trope at the end of Paul's letters where he says, I, Paul, write this with my own name, with my own hand. And it's because we think Paul is going blind by the time he's writing these letters. He has an amanuensis, a scribe that he's dictating to. And then at the very end, Paul writes this one line, I, Paul, write this with my own hand, just as a sign of validation. So that when the letter shows up to somebody else, they see Paul's handwriting at the very end and they know it's really from him. Okay? The Gospels do not have this at all. The Gospels don't have who it's written by. They don't have who it's written to. They don't have anything about their audience or their group that they're coming from. Nothing. We have later historical sources that tell us which Gospels are written by whom. We don't have any evidence that those people are right. We don't have any evidence that those people know anything more than anybody else. So the author is technically anonymous. He does not identify himself in any way. None of the Gospels do. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all anonymous. I don't even think, does Luke say his own name when he's writing to Theophilus? He at least tells us a supposed audience, but most scholars think that Theophilus is fake. Theophilus means the lover of God. That's what the name means. And so most people think Luke is writing this and saying, if you consider yourself someone who loves God, I have compiled all these sources together for you, right? Not a real like Roman person, I think is what we're traditionally taught is there's this guy who is coming to Luke and saying, I'll give you money if you tell me about the gospel. And so Luke compiles the gospel for him. We think that's a fiction. That's not really the real story. So we have to figure out who the text is actually written by. And there's two ways that we do this. One, as Julian referred, there are extra biblical texts outside of the Bible that kind of tell us some things. We lump this into the category of church history. And that should always be taken with a grain of salt. That should always be taken with, okay, but why are they telling us this way? How do they know it's this way? Most of the time, it is simply, this is what they were taught, or this is what they were told, or I just think this is the case. So what they tend to do is they say, in the Gospel of Mark, we have this biography. We think that the person was probably this ethnicity, and we think the person was probably from this area and had this religious background and had these certain bents, right? And so they look at things inside the text, and they'll say, well, Mark seems to be familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. He seems to be familiar with these sorts of things. So maybe Mark is Jewish. But he's explaining Jewish rituals, and he's translating Aramaic words into Greek. So maybe the area that he's writing to is non-Jewish. Maybe he's writing to the Gentiles. Let's spell that correctly. And if he is describing these different things and naming certain names that appear to be like Roman Latin names, maybe he's writing from Rome. We invent this story. Okay, we invent what I think of it in terms of like, I watch a lot of, CSI and Hawaii Five-0 and all that. You create a profile of the criminal. So you don't know who did it, but you create a profile. He's a 30s to 40s white man. He's 6'2". He's left-handed, whatever it is, right? And then you go through your list of suspects to find somebody who fits the profile you made. So then what we do is we've created this profile, and then we go through books like Acts, and we look for names. And we think there's all these names. Who fits this profile that we made? All right. And for this profile, there's a name that kind of rises to the surface, and it's John Mark. Why don't we just call him John? Well, there's already several other Johns running around in the first century. And so this is more of an identifier. Okay. But Mark is a super common name. Marcus, right? Think of how Latin and how Roman the name Marcus is, right? And so identifying him as just Mark would also not be helpful. And so this is probably his full name in the story, but we call him Mark because within Christianity, there's already other Johns running around. And we developed the story about Mark. Oh, he was following Paul around at this point. He was following Peter around at this point. And eventually this story transmits. It comes down to us. I don't want to say that this is all fiction, but I also kind of want to emphasize that this is not in the Bible. This is not biblical. So when we say Mark wrote this, we're kind of taking a leap of faith when we say that, right? And I also want to say this because if you encounter somebody who says, well, I don't think Mark wrote this, or you see this a lot in John, I don't think John wrote this. I don't want you to immediately think, oh, you're a heretic, you're an unbeliever, you don't believe in the Bible. I bring this up because it is a very valid argument to make, to say, well, the Gospels are anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. This is our best guess, but the guess could be wrong. And also, the person who wrote it did not find it necessary to tell us who they were. We assume the audience initially receiving the gospel does know who it comes from, because it wouldn't really have much authority without that. But we also know that the text itself has authority given to it by the church throughout the centuries. Okay? We know a lot of this from Eusebius. Let's see if I can spell this. Probably not. Is that an E maybe? I don't know. Eusebius is a church historian in the late 2nd, early 3rd century, maybe. But Eusebius doesn't know any of this firsthand. Eusebius says that he's getting all this from Papias. Papias is making these claims. Papias is saying Matthew wrote his first and he was one of the disciples. Mark followed Peter around and wrote down his gospel. Luke followed Paul around and wrote down his gospel. John was one of the disciples. But we don't have anything that Papias ever wrote. We only know about Papias because Eusebius tells us about Papias. So it's like another step removed from this. And then even further removed, you have Augustine, who's in like the 300s, writing from Africa, talking about the stuff that he's reading in Eusebius and Papias. Okay? This is where we get our church traditional stories, but they are pretty far removed. Now, to be fair to them, Papias is coming here and saying, well, I heard it from them, right? Papias is saying, I heard it from Clement, who sat at the feet of Peter. And if you are familiar with church tradition and church history, this is a valuable claim to make. To say that Peter, who was the lead disciple, Peter taught Clement, who taught Papias, who taught Eusebius. And because it's coming from Peter, it has authority. Good on this? Okay. Technically, the author is anonymous, but we are all going to say Mark because of ease of discussion, because it's easier to speak this way, right? But I think I emphasize this in essentially every class I have with you all. You really need to be aware of what in your Bible is real, is the Bible, and what in your Bible is added later, right? Have we all talked about this before? So the name of the gospel is not in the Bible, right? The little section headers that you might see are not in the Bible. Those are added later. The way that I say it to make it, more jarring to you, they're fake. The name of the gospel is fake. The little section headers, Jesus heals a man at Capernaum, that's fake. The chapter divisions are fake. The idea that there's a difference in the last verse in chapter 1 and the first verse in chapter 2 is fake. The verse numbers are fake. None of the verse numbers existed when Mark actually wrote this. Okay? The punctuation is fake. When a sentence ends with a period and then a new sentence starts, that's added later. Mark did not write that. Okay? So you really need to be aware of the things in your text that you're looking at that are not really part of the text. Another thing in your Bible, a lot of us, I don't have it here. A lot of us will have a little column in the middle that has a bunch of verses, cross references. Those are all fake also. Those are just a random editor sitting in his couch in the 21st century, thinking of verses that relate. Okay. And then I think you all know all the stuff under the line here at the bottom. This is all fake as well. This is an editor giving you additional notes about the translation or whatever else. Good on all of this? So when you're reading the text, you really need to be sure that you're not committing yourself theologically to something that's not really there. Right? If we believe the Bible is inspired, which we do, that does not mean you think that the punctuation is inspired or the paragraph breaks or the section headers. You don't have to believe those are inspired. Right? The great example of this is we always call the story the prodigal son. But most scholars look at this now and say, that's not what the story's about. The story is about the father who had two sons, right? And so now I think you see a lot of pushback where a lot of section headers will call that a man who had two sons. Or because Luke is telling you this in the same story where he's talking about a shepherd who lost one sheep out of 100, a woman who lost one coin out of 10, a man who lost one son out of 2, right? And so they reframe the story to make it fit with the other two stories that Luke is telling us in that section. Good on this? I feel like I'm referencing Luke a lot for us not getting there at all. For the audience of Mark, it's the same thing. We have no idea. We can make assumptions. We can make guesses. From the stuff that I talked about a minute ago, Mark tells us, he explains Jewish rituals to us. Why is it that they're cleaning their hands? Why is it that these cisterns are filled with water? Why is it that they're waiting by this pool? Mark explains these things. And what does that imply to you about Mark's understanding of his audience? It implies that they need an explanation, that these things do not make sense apart from the explanation. Okay? So a lot of people will read this and think maybe they're not Jewish. Maybe Mark is writing for a Gentile audience. Or what could also be likely is that it's a Jewish audience in diaspora. Are you all familiar with this term? A Jewish audience that is not in Jerusalem or Judea. So, like, there are Jews in Rome who live there in diaspora. It's a Jewish community outside of Judea. All right. You're familiar with this probably because, I mean, like in the Old Testament, the Jews are swept out of Judea. And so that's part of the diaspora. But also, I think in our kind of popular times now, we refer to like the African diaspora. So white colonists came and kidnapped Africans and dragged them all over the world. And now they live in diaspora, right? So African Americans are technically a community in diaspora. They're removed from their homeland. Okay. So there's a chance that this could be the case. And Mark is just explaining these things, not because they're not Jewish, but because they're not familiar with the rituals that happen in Jerusalem. Okay. He also translates Aramaic terms because he assumes that the audience does not know Aramaic. So it's unlikely that he's writing to, Christians in Jerusalem or like Jewish believers in the Messiah in Jerusalem. Good on this? Let me see if I have any other notes before I move on audience. Yeah. We also think that the audience has some knowledge of the gospel already, right? That's why they're interested in it. That's why Mark can start off the gospel by saying, this is about the Son of God. This is why he can just talk about Pilate and not really tell you who he is. Luke gives you Pilate's title, and Mark just says Pilate. He doesn't have to explain terms like rabbi or Gehenna or amen, because it's assumed that these people are already familiar loosely with Christian terminology. Good on this? Did anyone feel rushed while they were reading Mark's gospel? If you could sit down and read it in one sitting, did you feel rushed? Yes, like you're running through it. That's great. I argue that is intentional, that Mark has designed his gospel to feel that way. All right, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I think that's why he drops you down. Movies do this. Anybody familiar? Movies and books that start like this, just right in the middle of the story. Anybody know the term? I actually don't know how to spell it. In medias res, in the middle of things. This is from like high school English. We learned this. The story starts and just goes and tells you what's happening, and you kind of get the background information later. Mark kind of does this, except Mark doesn't really give you the background information, which, looking at it that way, you think, oh, I can imagine Matthew would read this and say, oh, there's some more story here that I could add. Or probably like the worst interpretation would be Matthew reading it and saying, I could do that better. Right? And saying, I could fill in the gaps that Mark left, and I could present a better gospel than Mark did. That's kind of the like competitive version of Matthew. But some version of this is probably what happened. Matthew reads Mark's gospel and thinks, oh, but there's so much other stuff we could be talking about. There's so much background information. And we'll talk about that next week when we get to Matthew. Let's spend a minute and talk about the date of Mark. For all of you who've had me before, and I asked this last week, what is the most important date in early church history? 70. Why? The temple is destroyed. Okay? Even if you are a believer in the Messiah in 69 AD, you are reevaluating your life and your religion in 70 because of this. All right? So with all of the Gospels, there is always a debate about if the Gospel was written before or after 70. This is kind of the turning point, the focus of debate. Why is this? One, Jesus is frequently talking about the temple, and at some places talking about the destruction of the temple. You see this a lot in Matthew, right? Destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. Woe to you, Jerusalem. I would have protected you from the upcoming calamity, right? Now, if you are a secular, one of these like Jesus seminar kind of guys we talked about before, you don't believe in prophecy, right? So if in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple, what does that tell you about the date of Mark? Yes. If you don't believe in prophecy, it can only be written after the temple is destroyed. So they would probably say, Jesus didn't actually say this. Mark wrote this to make it seem like this is all part of, Jesus knew this was going to happen. The other, probably less skeptical approach would be, Jesus made a lot of prophecies. He said a lot of things, and this one became important because it came true, because the temple actually was destroyed. Mark Goodacre has a New Testament podcast, and he teaches New Testament classes. I think he's a professor at Duke. He's great. He has this excellent British accent. He's really fun to listen to. But he makes this argument and compares it to, there's a documentary about the man who painted 9/11. And it shows this man who in the mid 1990s painted a picture of the New York skyline and painted in the picture planes crashing into the Twin Towers. But this is years before 9/11. And so he's saying it was a prophetic painting that I painted. Now, Mark makes the analogy to say, yeah, but this guy painted a lot of prophetic pictures. And the only reason this one made a documentary is because 9/11 did happen. The other prophetic pictures we don't know anything about because they didn't come true. But because this one did come true, and it was so calamitous to us in our collective memory. Think about, I assume all of you are born after 9/11, right? For me, I was 10. I had just had my 10th birthday. So I was born on September 10th, and I went to a party. I actually got pink eye at the party, and I had to stay home the next day. So I skipped school on 9/11, the day after my 10th birthday. So I was at home with my mom watching the news, and I remember all of it. That's kind of my first big memory that I can't remember much before that. It is a striking memory, me watching it on the news with my mom at home. And everybody who was alive at the time has some sort of memory like that because it was such a searing, cataclysmic event in our collective memory. The destruction of the temple is like that. And so if you are a Christian in 71, you're thinking back on this cataclysmic event and you remember, oh, Jesus said something about the temple. Oh, Jesus said something about the temple being destroyed. I wonder if this is what he was talking about, right? Now, a lot of that presupposes that Jesus couldn't look into the future and see that the temple would be destroyed. I think most of us would say, yeah, but he could. So it makes sense that he would be saying these things before the temple is destroyed, and Mark would write them down before the temple is destroyed. Or we could look at it and say, when he's talking about the destruction of the temple, we all know he's not talking about the temple. What's he really talking about? He's talking about his body, right? That you'll destroy my body, and in 3 days, I'll rebuild it. I'll come back, right? I think John explicitly tells us this. He wasn't talking about the temple. He was talking about the temple of his body, or something along those lines, explaining the theological background of it. But this is a turning point for when you date Mark. More conservative, like fundamentalist, biblical inerrant kind of people will probably date Mark at 65. And the reason this is so important to date Mark is, what does this say about all the other Gospels? Well, if Matthew and Luke are both using Mark as a source, they have to come after Mark. Right? That makes sense. You can't copy a paper if the paper's not been written yet. So then if Mark is written in 65, then Matthew can't have been written until, 75. We'll say 80. Luke can't have been written until 85. And then, I think we, like conservative estimates, try to put John as early as 90. Okay? But this all hinges on Mark being written here. If you say instead that Mark is written in 75, what does that do to all the other dates? All of it gets pushed back. So now Matthew isn't written until 90, and Luke is written in 100, and John is written in 120. Right? And you see how the difference here impacts all the other gospel dates. Good? It doesn't matter very much when we think these things are written. The only thing it really impacts is how far away it is from the historical Jesus, and if we think they are reflecting on the destruction of the temple. Even all of these dates put Matthew and Luke after the destruction of the temple. So maybe when Mark has Jesus talking about Jerusalem, he is trying to give comfort to a Christian community who's now in mourning, trying to understand themselves apart from the temple. How do we understand our religious practice now that the temple is gone? Maybe Matthew is trying to speak to that. Maybe Luke is trying to speak to that. Maybe Luke is subtly being critical of the empire because his audience knows that the empire just came in and destroyed the temple, right? In Luke, we'll talk about this when we get there. Anytime there's an issue of justice, doing the right thing, in Luke, Rome always does the wrong thing. In Luke, Pilate knows that Jesus is innocent and lets him get killed anyway. And that is the wrong thing to do. In Acts, you see this all the time. Roman officials know that Paul is innocent and they arrest him anyway, or they beat him anyway. Rome is always doing the unjust thing. And maybe that's a commentary on Rome unjustly destroying the temple. Go ahead, Julian. Yes, you're right. We have in the New Testament, we have our documents. We also have translations. The New Testament is very quickly translated into Latin and to Coptic and Syriac and Aramaic. And those translations exist fairly early. But this is still 2nd and 3rd century that we have any of these documents. The earliest manuscript, the earliest fragment of anything that we have in the Gospels, as far as I know, is called P52. And it is a tiny postcard. It's a fragment of papyrus that's like this big. And on it, it has a couple of verses from, I think, John 18. We date this to like late 2nd century, as far as I know. And again, there's debates about this. It could be that this is written or that this was, recovered from 190, or it could be from 220. We don't really know. But this is still very late, and everybody knows that John is written by now. Nobody's really arguing about this. You have Eusebius, that we talked about a minute ago, who is writing in the 2nd century. And if he is writing and quoting Papias, and Papias is referencing some texts, those texts have to exist. But then there's this whole debate about, well, is Papias just telling stories? Does he have a text in front of him? Or is he just recalling these oral traditions? There's all sorts of debate about all of these sorts of things. But they do give us a very firm end date. Nobody can argue that John is written after 190. Because we have physical evidence that it's written down. Nobody can argue that Mark is written after 110 or whatever, because we have Papias referencing Mark in 120. And Mark had to have existed earlier for it to be written down and for Papias to reference it, right? So we have these limitations on it where it has to have been written after Paul, essentially, but before these other big stamps. And then there's this whole realm of critical textual scholarship, which I am not very into. It seems very boring to me. Where they look at, the way that scribes write, and the way that the scribe writes their alpha over time changes. And scribes in the 1st century write their alphas this way, and scribes in the 3rd century write their alphas this way. And because of the way that P52 writes its alpha, we could date it to here. Oh, it's so dull to me, right? I am much more a literary sort of person of, I want to read the text and see what the author is trying to argue rhetorically in the text. And examining these manuscripts for minute handwriting differences, or, they'll look at like how big the scribe is writing the letters. I'm just like, man, I could not care less about these sorts of things. But I'm glad that other people do care about them, because that's where this debate comes in, is trying to date these sorts of things. Scientific dating doesn't really help us with a lot of these sort of things. Carbon dating and those sort of things that you think of. As far as I know the science, carbon dating can tell you the millennia that something comes from. So if you find a fossil in the ground, carbon dating can help you figure out if it's from the Paleolithic era or whatever else, but it can't tell you if it's from the 1st century or the 3rd century. It's not that fine-tuned as far as I know. So we try these sorts of methods, but they don't always work. We have to look at what material is this document written on, right? Is it written on papyrus? Is it a manuscript of a scroll? Or is it a codex? A codex is a later development in biblical tradition. It's a book, essentially, that's like bound in wood or leather to protect the document. But this happens later. So if you find a codex, that's obviously a later item that you have. Good on this? Good. The dates are all an argument, all of them. I want us to try to get away from the idea that earlier dates are necessarily better, because that implies that the Christian community is not capable of remembering their stories across generations, which I think they are. I think because it's a vastly oral tradition, they are not necessarily, let's write this down as quick as possible before we forget. I don't think that's the case. I'm very comfortable with saying Mark is written intending to help his community after the temple is destroyed, to try to help them reconcile with this. Some people argue that John is written because John, all of the disciples are now dead. All of the eyewitnesses to Jesus have now died, and the church is in turmoil because they thought Jesus would come back before the last disciple died. And now that the last apostle, John, has died, we need to write down these stories. Some people also don't like that, but that seems to be part of the thing is there's this testimony of the beloved disciple, and we're writing down his testimony to remember it. Maybe it's because he died. You have this weird story where Peter is saying, well, what about the beloved disciple? I heard that he's never going to die. And Jesus says, no, that's not what I said. I didn't say he would never die. I said that he would have a certain type of death. And so maybe John is writing this to correct a certain misinterpretation that Christians have that the apostles wouldn't die. You could see the appeal now. Oh, no, Jesus never said they wouldn't die. He said that they would die according to his plan. That's different. Good? I don't think it's necessarily bad to have later dates for some of these things. And we'll talk about why. I guess we'll probably, because we only have 10 minutes left, we'll probably talk about why on Thursday when we get into, I've got this whole slide of unique aspects. This is part of what's at issue. People will say that Mark has a low Christology because people invented the idea that Jesus was God later. I think that's silly. I think that's a bad reading of Mark. But a lot of us more conservative Christians will try to say, no, Mark was written very early to try to counteract this narrative. And I just don't think that's necessary. Good. Let's go back. Is this where we were? Yeah. Let's talk about this and then we'll finish for today. What is the purpose that Mark is trying to answer? Ooh, there's a typo. Let's see if I can fix that in the middle of the presentation, because that's just going to drive me nuts. I don't know if it updates on your end. How does Mark start his story? Who does he introduce Jesus as? Yeah, so I mean, the first line is, let's pull it up so I don't misquote it. So the first line in Mark is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So he doesn't say Messiah, but he does say Son of God, right? Which, I mean, is a pretty big claim to make about a first century carpenter, craftsman, whatever he was, right? This is a big claim to make. He tries to connect Jesus to this divine relationship and also to this like idea of a suffering servant, probably what we get from, Isaiah. But then he's also going to downplay a lot of Jesus's divine qualities. We'll talk about on Thursday why this is. Some scholars look at this and say, well, that's because Mark didn't believe that Jesus was divine. I just don't buy that. I think if you don't think Jesus is divine, you don't start your story with the Son of God, this high and lofty title connecting him to the divine. So then we have to come up with some other reason why Jesus appears very human. In some places, he appears impotent, right? Like he doesn't have the power to do certain things. We'll talk about this on Thursday. The other thing that we have to look at is in this purpose of describing Jesus, we'll talk about on Thursday. How is it that he's trying to portray Jesus? What is it that he's trying to say about them? John has a very specific agenda when he's trying to portray Jesus. For John, Jesus is in control the whole time. In fact, he created everything. And if Jesus wanted out of it, he could get himself out. Jesus is not just the one who made everything. He is actively sustaining everything, even on the cross. So the Roman soldiers who are murdering Jesus, the only reason they continue to exist is because Jesus wills that they continue to exist to murder him, right? John has Jesus just way up there. Mark doesn't, but I think there's a reason why. There is a purpose in his presenting Jesus that way, probably to try to elicit a human response about a human Jesus. That he's not just this high and lofty divine being who can walk through walls and do all this cool stuff. That he has a human biological aspect to him. Maybe Mark is trying to emphasize this to counteract some sort of very divine, very spiritual. Maybe he wasn't even human. Maybe he was just a divine spirit who was sent here to look human. Mark is trying to counteract this narrative. Go ahead. I think you're right. There are aspects where he is displayed as human, but also doing things that are superhuman. What I want us to look at, though, I think we tend to see the miracles and the things that Jesus does and assume they're all divine. Oh, he healed this sick person. It's because he's God. That is not necessarily what a first century Jew would think. There's this book, which I don't necessarily agree with it. Let's see if I have it. Where is it? It's called A Man Attested by God. And where is it? Yeah, here it is. We read it for again, I don't have the cover on it, so me showing you the book is not very helpful. So good job. Good job, me. He goes through a lot of the Gospels and says, let's look at this story and remove the idea that Jesus is God. Let's look at this story. Jesus isn't God. Let's look at this story. He's not God. And I mean, he takes all of this stuff to kind of say the Gospels are not even intending to present Jesus as God, which I disagree with the thesis. But his argument is pretty solid to say, just because Jesus healed a sick person does not mean he's divine. And no first century Jew would hear that and think that he is. You know this because the disciples get the same powers. The disciples are able to perform miracles and heal people. The disciples are able to cast out demons. The disciples are able to raise people from the dead, right? So it is not just the mere act of miracle working that makes someone divine. The author, Kirk here, also looks at these terms, Son of God and Son of Man, and points to Old Testament references as well as like other Second Temple Judaic texts. Think of like Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff, to say these terms are not divine terms either. That there are characters in the Old Testament who are referred to as Son of Man or Son of God. Daniel is referred to as a Son of Man. And Daniel refers to other beings, angelic beings, who are not God as sons of God. Adam is called a son of God, right? Moses is performing a lot of the same like nature miracles that Jesus does. And we don't think Moses is God. Moses can walk on water in the like Second Temple texts. So just the fact that Jesus walks on water doesn't necessarily imply that he's divine. Now, I say that not to say the Gospels don't present Jesus as divine, but to encourage you all to read the text more deeply to say, where is Mark pointing to Jesus as divine? So I would say in the story where Jesus is walking on water, the fact that he's walking on water does not imply that he's God. But Mark does have this interesting thing where Jesus is walking past the disciples who are struggling on the boat. And it says that Jesus intends to pass them by. And then when the disciples do see him, they think that he's a spirit, right? So it's not just that he's walking on the water. Peter can walk on the water, right? In the other gospels, Peter does this. It's not just a divine thing. But the way that Mark tells the story, there's two interesting things. One, Jesus is passing them by. When God reveals himself to Moses, he hides Moses in the rock and passes by in front of him. That is the term that Mark is using might imply he's passing them by to reveal who he really is. The same way that God reveals himself by passing by. Or it could also be when they're looking out, they see him and they think that he's a spirit. I think most of our translations say a ghost. They think that Jesus died and that's how he's floating on the water. But the term there implies to me, Genesis 1, the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters, right? That might be more of a divine claim. They look at him and they think, do you guys remember in Genesis how God floated over the water? Well, that's what Jesus is doing right now, right? It's not that he's walking on the water. It's not that he's performing a miracle, but Mark is subtly implying the way that he tells the story that Jesus is more than what he appears. And we know this because he starts off by saying he's the Son of God, which I do think at the very beginning is a divine claim, even though in the text and other places it might not necessarily be. So we'll look at these sorts of things, but I do want us to get away from the idea that any miracle Jesus performs, it's because he's God. I don't think that's the intent of the gospel authors. I think that they are intended to show his miracle working power, but in the first century, there are a lot of miracle workers. We know this in the Old Testament. Moses is performing miracles, but so are the Pharaoh's magicians, right? Jesus can cast out demons, but so can other Jewish teachers. Other rabbis can do this as well. Good on this? Julian, go ahead. I think you're right. And, you know, I think somebody like Kirk would look at Matthew and say, well, Jesus was human. And then at the end, when he lived this great life and died, God resurrected him and gave him all authority on heaven and on earth. Not because he was always divine, not because he was this pre-incarnate Son of God, but because he lived the good life that God wanted him to live, and God honored that by raising him from the dead. And now he has elevated Jesus to become the Christ, and now he's seated at the right hand of the Father. But that's not a position that he had before, that he wasn't divine before, and the story doesn't intend for you to think that. And I just don't buy that aspect of the argument. I don't think that the stories are trying to present Jesus in those terms as merely human who is later selected by God to become his son or his heir or his Christ. I don't think that's the case. I mean, for theological reasons, but also I don't think that's what the stories are trying to say. I think the stories are trying to do something different. And it's the same thing that we talked about a second ago with Mark. If he's starting off to tell you that Jesus is the Son of God and then downplaying that for the rest of the story, I think there's a reason why, rhetorically. And that's what we're going to get into on Thursday, is to look at Mark all together and try to look at, I've got this whole list of things about Mark. And we're going to look through this list and look through the text and try to see what is it rhetorically that Mark is getting out of doing these things. What is it that Mark rhetorically achieves by downplaying Jesus's godhood or by rushing us through the story, right? And I think we'll come to the end of Thursday, hopefully getting through all of this and looking at Mark and trying to answer that question. So I will see you all on Thursday.